Éiceaphobal agus fáilte roimh go dtí an dara seimineár sa Spreagtar ómós áite de chuig na togra Community Climate Action Projects. Is togra é seo ag Éiceaphobal Chloch Shiurdáin I bartnéireacht le sonárte Carrigdúilre agus Burren College of Art tá Fíor Queen fáilte roimh fad. Welcome to this, the second of our seminar series entitled Ómós Áite, which is honoring our place. And that's what we're trying to do in this project led by Clochjordan Eco Village in partnership with Sonárta, with Carrigdúilre and with the Burren College of Art, which is to develop resources around issues of community, of biodiversity, of inclusiveness, solidarity, and of course of climate, for sharing with climate action groups at local levels, fud na hÉireann, up and down the country. So we're welcoming today our visitors and our guests. We'll introduce those in a moment. This whole project is funded by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, and it is being recorded as a resource to have for as part of the outcome of this project. Tá an togra seo muoinethe ag an rainn cóthíal aeráide agus cumarsáide agus tá an seisiún seo, na seisiún fad tá sé tafada le go mbeadh sé mar áis a going le roinnt leis na grúpaí pobal fud fad na hÉireann go bhfuil muid ag soláthar achfaní dóibh. The theme of this seminar is Liberating the Imagination, ag Fuascailt na Samhlaíochta, agus sé an smaoinemh taobh den ná go bhfuil sort technobabble, technoglo is féidirling a chuir in Gaeilge, go mór in uachtar sa díoscuirsa marall arthú aeráide. So climate discourse is often very much dominated by a sort of a technobabble, and we want to draw attention to the fact that this doesn't change people's hearts. It may give them any information in their minds, and so there's a need to draw in resources from the imagination. Agus a gohaire an sean éireann ón siocht ghailech atá going ón or jonga dúchais agus ón siocht os na clachtais a bhuineann leis sin. Agus mar sin gur féidirling an Gaeilge a bhlasú, seachas bheith ag labhart faoi tábhacht na Gaeilge tá an webinar seo dátheangach. We're making it bilingual as a way both of giving people a sense of enjoying the language, not just talking about the importance of the language, but also as a way of modelling a new way of trying to live our lives in Ireland bilingually. Is sort of múnla nua atá muid ag éirí Burren Cín an Jobh. Mar tá éon rud le rá ag aine fáilte roimh a chuir sa chat I méarla nó in Gaeilge. So if you have anything to say, if you have any questions, put them in the chat during the seminar, and we'll get to those. We'll draw them in. So our aigling mar sin tá mé chun cuireadh go Martin Hawkes anis chun na cainteoirí na híana speisialta tá going in Jobh a chuir I bhór láthair.
Gur míle maith a fadar agus fiorchuoin fáilte ribh gach aine atá in you. You're mightily welcome, agus Peadar said. This is going to be from bilingual, and it's designed in that sense to re-gift ourselves what is in fact a gift of our own language, which has been complicated by history of suppression and then forced reintroduction. So it's past time that we took back control of our own language as our gift to ourselves. So, Baimwujig Faimu Trivan the Gaeilge agus an Béarla, and whatever bit of Irish you have or don't have is fine. We will use whatever we have. We have three wonderful guests today who are going to look at Féidir na Samhlaíochta, liberating the imagination, as well as looking at the Fuinshi fáil san Gaeilge, what are the resources available in the language. And also, since this is about community action, we will be engaging with an exemplar of community action. So our three wonderful speakers today, and I want to welcome them sincerely for agreeing to share their wisdom, their activism, their imagination with us. We have Finola Ó Siochrú, who's now living in Kinvara. We have Dr. Tanya DePaor, who is an artist with a particular interest in ecology, and we have Declan Kelleher for Kilini Bwe from the Burren, and he is a wonderful activist and shows what can be done in our retirement. So without more ado, I'm going to ask each of our speakers just to say a few words, not more than 2 or 3 minutes, to introduce themselves and their practice so that we have a sense of who we are sharing this webinar with. So Finola, ar bhailad cúpla focail ará fút féin agus the cúlra, and I know it's very rich and multi-layered, but whatever you'd like to say that's relevant to our listeners today.
So I suppose when I was asked to do this, I realised I had 2 very separate parts involved. Agus dailt creasach mór idir in dá fortune. So a cainteoirí and gníomhaíocht. So in terms of the activism, I would be, well, I suppose the main thing I would have done was to set up with other people Kinvara Climate Action Group. And within maybe the first year, we decided that we had to go with planting trees as a positive contribution to sort of go with all the bad news we were dealing with and spreading. So in those 3 years, we set up Kinvara Ballandarim Tree Gang, and we've planted about 3,500 native trees ourselves and distributed about 4,000 others for local people to plant. So and the first project we did was actually a citizen science project of exploring the Miyawaki method of planting. So shin peva wine, agus tashin prevas and aealaíontóirí féidir, that's based in science in a way. The other side I just mentioned then is, I suppose my father's from West Kerry, and even though I grew up in Dublin, I'm often think I grew up in West Kerry because the influence is so strong. I lived there in the 80s for a number of years. So, Nurquinimer Cadafoiris O'Hare Darka Dúra and Son. I think the biggest thing I came away with from there in terms of the landscape was not so much any real knowledge of plants and trees, because that I wasn't taught that really, apart from the odd thing. But it was a sense of the ancientness of the landscape, and also the sense that nature is sacred, the sacredness of it. Formation. And so I suppose maybe it's because in West Kerry, there's very few trees, but everywhere are the Samhlaíochta, the pre-Christian sites and the Christian sites and the holy wells and the Trusana. So, and the Fuascailt and the Loganimnacha, Battle of Ventry Harbour, that was the biggest legacy I got there. And just to say that I've become a singer in either the Shannos tradition or the Irish language tradition there. And one of the CDs, one is of local songs and the other is of Christmas songs, because I felt that was missing from our society as well. So, an oration is docha.
And we look forward to hearing what you have to say very, very shortly in more comprehensive detail. So secondly, I'll call on Tanya DePaor, who is, I think, now lecturing in Mary I, but is quite familiar with the Burren, where she did her PhD, I think, in art. So with a focus on art and ecology. Tanya, aeráide.
Hello, Tom. Éiceaphobal a bheith round forta gnu sa córa seo, agus bavalam muile buchas huirta Martin, agus Peadar agus gachtainna a córa an tuairtam teachtas leach pobal anu. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much. And yes, I'm very familiar with the Burren College of Art. I suppose I'm an artist and a researcher. But most importantly, I think I'm a mother, and my research interest and my work really is in looking at how we engage young people and our children around more hopeful discussions and different kinds of languages around the kind of crises that we face at the moment. So as part of my research, I spent quite a lot of my time in the Beara Peninsula, and that became an extension of my remote and very beautiful and very quiet. A lot of the work that unfolded there. But the research, my family became very interested in what I was doing, and my father often would be asking me, "What are you doing running around those hills with the sheep?" And so through very kind of informal conversations, the family became really central to the research. And I began to look at the different knowledges that the different age groups had and the different perspectives. And so a lot of formed by questions that the children asked, reflections from concerns that arose about what are we going to do about the crisis. And so that underpinned, but in a very playful way, which hopefully you'll see in a while. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Gaurav, míle maith for everyone. And that sounds like a wonderful description of the role of the arts and imagination. Thirdly, we have today somebody who has been active in his local area in the Burren, and that is Declan Kelleher, who is going to share a few words of background. And I think, if I'm not correct, he was also a chair of the INTO once upon a time, but Declan is a very modest individual. So Declan, aeráide.
Garin Margaret watching. Hi, Carter Fad. It's Misha Declan as Kilnina and Shaw. Agus Vies Emma Munchor Vonskala. Flag me here Fad, Tommy Irie as an ish. Agus Fimmer Durt Martin, Boch Care coming up me, Liling Mihale Freshen. I suppose as a primary teacher, one of the things that I realized is that you can't teach the environment without actually going out into it. And it was one of the great pleasures that I've had to bring children out into the Burren, because teaching in Corrifin, we were located right in the southeastern end of the Burren, some of the most beautiful parts of it. And when you brought the children out to interact with the Burren and to look, listen, just in silence, to what was around them, to jot down their few points in relation to it, and to examine various things, whether it was maybe a cowl of a house that was there back in pre-famine times, and to imagine what life was like for the children as they grew up there. Your actual reward in terms of the children's poetry, art, language, environmental consciousness was always something great. Agus is Queen Lam Mardin Og, agus me Fosinius, well, vi me Foster Stolim Nora, Don Tim Robinson, Ling on Shaw, Marvi Labags with Foster Mawaher. And we had Tim in the house for a month when he was doing his cartography in relation to the southeastern part of the Burren. And I greatly admired the way he went out to speak to all the local people, to listen to the local pronunciations, and to try and get the place names right. He always said, look, you know, a great technical job was done at the beginning of the 19th century, Mother le Luganamaka, August Marshenda, but Rinach Fiauler Valak, or Changan Gaeilge, August and Luganamaka, because they were made to fit into an entirely different phonetic system. And he always thought that that was a great pity. Look, I suppose I can't prove to anybody here today, I can't prove it scientifically, that a knowledge of Luganamaka is going to save us from climate change. But, and I think this is critical, Rihan mass the oid hain, August Tishkent the oid hain, Rihan she go moor hele le massive got dulra, August an Timpeland. August Marvin massive got an Darod Shen. Then I think you're going to be very careful and very conscious of your environmental footprint and what you're doing. So I'll be showing a few exemplars of Luganamaka that we put together in Kilnaboy through the work of Common Éiceaphobal Chloch Shiurdáin. This work will be continuing over the next 2 years. Agus tábhacht tnú go mór le chainteoirí níos Jenny.
Gur míl magat Declan agus bei muidig tnú go mór leis an fineise atá got fuaid de factus mar agódaí phobal I gil iníne bui is íontach an tainméis sin or tongue twister. Anyway, bei muidig teachadaí an ghníomhaíocht sin níos déanaí ach ar dús tas nómuid leis an samhlaíochta. So we're going to begin with releasing the imagination. And we're going to start with Finola, and we're going to start with, as we said, this is going to be an embodied and experiential webinar. So we want to actually embody that about which we speak, both in terms of language and in terms of imagination. So I'm going to invite Finola as part of this first section on the Liberating the Imagination to introduce a wonderful Rusk Avergeen, which she has recorded as part of one of her double CDs. And I think Finola will give us some background on that, and then we will listen to the Rusk. So aeráide Finola.
It's not sadly on either of my CDs, it's just on video form, but anyway, Kadisha. Yeah, this poem, Rusk Avergeen, if you can call it a poem, it's a chant. It's our first and original poem of the first Gaeilge as he stepped onto the land of Ireland. He was Avergeen Macmillan, so he was the Milesians, the 7th mythological race to come and settle in Ireland. And I mean, we don't have the original instructions that, for instance, the Bundóchasig in America had, but this you could see as our original poem, or I don't know, sacred text really is what it is. What else to say about it? I think that's enough. It's the start. Oh, yeah, just to say that I suppose it would have become our Bunchloch as Sinamach. So it would have formed the basis of the whole bardic tradition, which would have stretched for maybe up to 2,000 years from that time. So it's this text we're about to hear, which I put music to, is absolutely essential into our sensibilities, our Gaelic sensibilities. So it's Leora Machin is Dochar.
Good míle magat Finola. Eileen is in charge of tech today, but I've been asked to do the tech on this one, so hopefully it will work. And this is a wonderful rendition of Rusk Avergeen.
Aina
I suggest that we hand back to Finola to go into that, go back to Roscavregeen and its importance, and to tell us more about her work.
Just to say, just to give you a flavour of it, the English would be, I'm the wind on the sea, I'm the flooding wave, I am the sound of the sea, I'm the stag of 7 peaks, I am a hawk on the cliff, I'm a burst of sunshine. So take it to a maid shin. It's, I'll have to switch off that chat now. Take it to a maid shin, it's speaking about our oneness with nature in the most powerful terms. And then if you turn to the Irish, and this is where, like Declan, I can't prove anything, but the more I think about it, the more I feel the effect of singing that song and other iconic songs like it. I feel there is a depth of resonance that comes through in that has such power. It literally leaves me shaking for 10 minutes after singing it. Agus fanamach gwil gumrahan eile a chloshin anra, and sais vibe came. So Shedem Hengul court unter Sitangan. There's a sort of a resonance that comes through, probably because that language has been spoken for maybe up to 3,000 years here. When I sing it, or others of the Howrán Mura, let's say, it affects an audience in a completely different way. Let's say if you're at a session and you're singing the usual stuff, and then you sing a big Shanno song, the resonance is much lower and much higher is how I experience it. It sort of stops everything, completely changes the energy for good or ill. So I'm not sorry, Braham go will koch satan, agus na takes in the shin. So that's an iconic one, and please look at it. And if you come then, we're very lucky, because when we came to, so that was the Druidic culture, that survived right through early Christianity, as Dolores Whelan was saying. And we have that other wonderful sacred text, which I find is equally powerful, or almost as powerful, let's say, Lúrach Fádric, where you probably know it. I arise today by the strength of heaven. And it goes through all of the elements. Arisht, in both cases, well, in that one, I had to go back to the Irish and I had to put music to it myself. And the same with Roscavregeen. Bhína focailagum ach ní raibh ceolagum. And for me, the reason I had to do that is because when I'm in nature, in a place where you feel the forces of nature, I need to sing something like that. I don't know what everybody else does. We're probably very private about what we do in places like that. But ní raibh sé sáúil dósa for a focail béarla, áráin béarla le rá. So listen to Roscavregeen. It's perfect for the top of a mountain or in any kind of wilderness. It just completely says it. So sin cóch na tangan and stólim sin gohfuil sé sin fíorthachta. The other major thing that I think we have to offer on cultúr Gaeilge is the way that I feel an awful lot of people are turning. We've seen the limits of the Eurocentric, Descartesian, colonial, capitalist worldview, where nature is seen as commodity to be exploited as much as possible for humans, and humans are completely separate. So a lot of people thought to the indigenous peoples for their wisdom. Agus tá go leor daoine ní sé casa chun an cultúr Gaeilge chomh sa clí chéine. And I think the most important aspect of that is our relationship with nature. We see that the indigenous people had a completely different relationship with nature, whereby they regarded the natural world as their relatives. And they saw that humans were the youngest, and so we had to learn from trees. Nis tá rud céanna sa bhéile is Gaeilge, ach níor higas I gcearta go dtí gur léas Abermist until I read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book. I didn't fully understand what we had in our tradition. For instance, you know, we all knew that knowledge came from the hazel tree, the nut that fell into the pool, and the Bredan that ate it, and John McCool got his wisdom from eating that. But I always understood that as sort of a fanciful linear thing. But if you then see that John McCool saw the hazel as a sacred tree, which he did, you complete the circle. So you have that circle of reciprocity that the Indigenous people talk about and honour. So tá go leor rudaí atá mar an ggéanna idir an dárad. Agus tá mise fáca le go leor ceistena mar jaolar cén Gaeilge adrin agus an nádó. Aber take a meet go raibh Gael an ghar. Obviously we had a very close connection to nature. But I'm much more interested now in the exact what was our relationship? Obviously trees, we know they were extremely important symbols in terms of both spiritual and in terms of kingship. I mean, the whole notion of Ireland, as we know, the 4 counties were represented by a sacred tree, and then the one in the middle, the mythological one, that sort of joined earth and land people to the landscape. So take me de shin. Take me aber na brehan laws, na breha cohasca, for instance, around trees. We know the depth of knowledge and value that people placed on trees there. But if you look at it but their intimate knowledge of trees, for instance, where they broke down the trees into the 4, the nobles, the Gaeilge, the nobles, the commoners, and the lower divisions of trees. And of course the fines if you were to interfere with them in any way, but also laying out who was entitled to what, and every aspect of the tree, from the berries to the nuts to the twigs to the proper wood, was appreciated and valued. So taking me to made shin, ach fós, you know, it's tashakasta. If you look at then the other evidence from the scientific point of view, we see it was a time of clearings actually, because they had the iron axe and so on, and it was the time of dairying, so cattle was equally important. So again, the question, you know, what was the relationship? Was it like the honourable harvests that the Indigenous people had, whereby, and very likely it was actually, where if you were going to cut a tree, you asked its permission. You cut it very carefully. You used every little bit. So úsáid fá gahéni. Tá go leor ceistena agam faoin Gael sin, because you could easily romanticize it based on those few things, or based on the richness of the language. And we see through the language how an darcha a bhí ag daoine ar an nádór, agus bhí sé difriúil ar an darcha tágain sa bhéarla for a gás. Agus is dóilim bhfuil mánachán me gan anamha sa tlí sin a cainteoirí. An darcha difriúil, an tlí go bhaca daoine an nádór is slí difriúil. Chuir a gás bhí, for instance, the way in Irish, within the Irish language, we saw nature. Monaghan talks of the 4 different ways of describing the different stages of sunrise. You know, Bána an lei, Fáinne gal an lei, Éirí an lei. Do you know? Or he talks of the 32 words for fields, or something like 40 words for rocks, depending on if they were in the sea, if they were sharp, if they were covered in water, if they were in fields. So that shows us that we had a complete intimacy with nature in a way that doesn't come across in the English language. So sin háit na go bhhain inspiráid, agus sin na ceiste na go bhhailm a ragart den hénig. You know, go méid tuiscin do bhad níos feargam cén Gael go bailach a bhí idir sinne agus an nádór. Neither will cainteoirí.
Garibh míle maith agat Finola agus Samhlaíochta faoin Samhlaíochta ach. You get such an embodied sense of that song, of Aberdeen stepping ashore, a foundational myth which is totally immersed in an earth-based cosmology, as it's been called. But maybe just before we move on to Tanya, you mentioned obviously precisely that fact that the Irish is so earth-based in its understanding, like Teangacha Ella Bundúchasig. Ach cad faoin teanga ag buint lei sin, you felt the need to sing it as Gaeilge, so I'm curious about that, where the need to sing that song as Gaeilge came from.
That's the thing about the resonance. I suppose, so mostly I would have been on hills in Kerry, and you had the sense of the ancientness. And I knew that English was just this kind of thin layer that's kind of superimposed on that landscape and on that culture. So for me, it just wouldn't make any sense to sing in English, although I do up there, but these are so much more satisfying. But I think it's more than just that knowledge, it's the resonance that does it. There is a soul power in that, both in the music we have, but in the words that we have, in the language, the way it comes through. And more I feel that it's a soul energy, which I can't prove, but anybody who hears it, you'll notice it. So equally, when, once I started learning the names of plants and trees, it made no sense to me to just know them in English. They were what we would have called them for maybe 200 years. And there would have been maybe 2,000 years of knowing them by other names. Do you know?
So a soul language, I think that's my takeaway from that answer. And it's giving us some great richness. English gives us wonderful scientific, detached understanding of the world. But if you want an embodied soul feeling about nature and our connection to it, then we're missing something if we fail to engage with the language. And I think the fact that we have so many people online today is reflective of that sense that we are beginning to reconnect with the importance of that Indigenous knowledge. So, Gorif Mila Mahagat Finola, and we'll hear more from you anon. But now we want to move on to the perspective of a visual artist, Tanya, who also embodies the Irish tradition, and that rollicking on the hills with the sheep, I think, comes center stage in this next speech, which she's going to introduce for us. Tanya, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce the work, and then I think Eileen is going to do some tech wizardry and put it on, and I can come back afterwards and talk through the I suppose the context of the work. So as part of my research, I looked obviously at lots of different things that were going on in the culture and different theorists. And I was really struck by a book that came out by a writer called Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement. And in it, he talked about the climate crisis being a crisis of imagination. And I began to become very interested in the role of culture, and as Finola says, around Indigenous cultures, the family. I looked at things like the connection that we have and the role that culture and language can play, as well as imagination, in how we see and understand and progress our thinking, developing an eco worldview towards sustainable futures. So it might be nice to show the piece first of all, and then I can come back maybe and talk about where the ideas came for the piece.
Is singa an tréad. Ní leis ach ihe can an barna a líana. Féchant is farra, fannacht sa nómit. Gan macna ver cadadorloch don imoch an talamh férig. Fanamid sa nómit. Éiceamid. Quanóig an tréad leis ag rathú. Seo an táthas a bhainean le bheith marachtáil sa nómit. Gan onat ach aracht an bheithíg. Bí, sú, a bheith nasc an tréad. Tahí an talún féad a chosa, na slata úra glasa a bhlaise. Bla an datig im hrón, blas an datig im véal, cealag an datig im húil. Is ag lanúint ag githe, is ag fannacht sa nómit, díreach an nómit seo. Ag marachtáil is ag an analú. Seo an táthas a bhaineann le Éiceacht, gur féidir fanacht sa nómad, gan bheith búrtha fé tada ach díreach an nómad seo. Bolamíd, chiamíd, aríamíd, brahamíd. Faramíd ortha is iad ag lasa a tínta go gasta. Faramíd ortha is iad ag fara na lasracha ag dús ag praba, ag scapa trí scartainna is sceacha. Aríamíd an fúdar atá fuha. Seasamíd an gnach ag fara is an tinne ag rínce le fána, ribíní daraga ag éiríní skille. Címíd an datach ag tshimhú is ag séda trasna an tlé. Címíd iad is iad ag gré níos gasta. Aríamíd an tagla is na lasracha is na tínta ag scapa go gastas níos gasta. Aríamíd ropa na ghuithe trasna an tlé ag aina na tínta. Aríamíd an fúdar ag pú go hagla. Címíd na lasracha ag alpa na talún go ciachrach. Címíd tilacha ag balú can farárú. Aríamíd an cré ag éiríníos teo, an téir ag tshimhú is an ghae ag éiríníos fiáine. Faramíd, ihamíd, aríamíd a líonra. Címíd iad ag teacht is ag amacht as réarc sa datach. Címíd na plándí ag dós ag searagú. Címíd dive na blondí is iad crumha. Da an talún ag ahrú ó bhuí go glas go hórga go dubh. Aríamíd an glas bhuigeacht ag dós ag searagú. Blasamíd, chiamíd, táimíd sa nómad. Is singe an tréad. Faramíd, táimíd sa nómad. Clenamíd na banáin, faramíd ortha is iad ag dridum le fána. Címíd na tínta ag fila. Címíd iad ag rúthir sús sios an chanic is na ribíní daraga ó bhuacha acha. Címíd a hille ag teacht. Cloisimíd na gléana. Aríamíd an tagla. Ihamíd an féir. Aríamíd an datach. Cloisimíd an ghae. Táimíd sa nómad. Cloisimíd na gléana. Címíd iad ag amacht as réarc. Cloisimíd na lasracha ag rínce trasna suas sios an tlé. Ihamíd na gléana is mu dubh agus dóite. Aríamíd an tas. Brahamíd an tost. Blasamíd an dive. Bolamíd an datach. Brahamíd an tas. Cloisimíd an ghae. Táimíd sa nómad. Tá ciúnas ann. Siúlamíd. Faramíd. Chiamíd an dive. Cloisimíd an tost. Brahamíd an tas. Siúlamíd. Chiamíd. Brahamíd. Is singe an tréad. Fanamíd sa nómad. Aríonn siad an slíomh. Címíd an dive. Ihamíd na slata. Brahamíd an féir ag fós go maul fénar gosa. Ihamíd. Táimíd.
So that was a beautiful translation by a friend of mine who's a teacher and a writer and a podcast maker who also has roots in Kerry, and he translated the poem and recited it So just to give you a little bit of background, I suppose my practice is rooted in ecology and eco-aesthetics and about community engagement and art education. And as part of my research, I looked at the Anthropocene, which is a big word. It translates as the age of man. And a lot of the signifiers in it are to do with climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. So I started to look at that, and I didn't really know what I was doing for quite a long time. But I thought that the paradoxes around those things around climate change and the Anthropocene, some things were made visible and some things were obscured, and particularly the connection between living entities and the environment. So Éiceanna on Trade explores this visually and poetically. It's a speculative, it imagines things from a speculative perspective, and it tries to look at it from the perspective of the other and to bring into dialogue and conversation what it means to be in the world. It uses language and imagery to prompt responses and to provoke a feeling and a sense of wonder. So ecology, which is really the root around my practice, explores the concept of home and interconnectedness, and it proposes a radical response to a lot of the kind of signifiers of the Anthropocene. It's a study of relationships between the human and non-human. Éiceaphobal or ecology is based around the three ecologies of society and the environment and the psyche. And so I was looking at kind of ethics and aesthetics around that to look at how we can promote a more helpful worldview. A lot of the culture at the moment, the mainstream culture, depicts climate change at a really large scale, and it becomes really unwieldy. And a lot of people will find that they don't want to talk about it or engage with it. It's just too big. The way it's promoted with some practices and cultural framing, it really looks at it from the perspective of spectacle and really unwieldy planetary kinds of scales. So combined with the language and vocabularies of the crisis, what it seems to do is promote a paralysis and a fear. So I was interested as well around language, about the indigenous knowledges, in particular, again, looking at it from an Irish perspective and in the memory of and the meaning around the Gaeilge and how we see and feel the world. So the pieces that you saw, I suppose, initially started off with the images of this photographs of the landscape, and the series, which started off as a series very unimaginatively titled Berlin Landscape, documented gorse fires in the Beara Peninsula. And this is the traditional practice of clearing land that's considered bad land, and it's usually to clear it to create pasture land for sheep. So initially what I was doing, I suppose, was trying to bear witness to this transformation. But when I started to reflect on the images which were up around my studio, and again, in walking with the children and the kind of questions that they were asking, I started to look at the images, and instead of seeing the burning landscape, and I started looking at consumption and the sheep consuming the land, the fire consuming the land, us consuming the sheep. So it seemed all very connected, and so I was trying to pick that apart. But I began to wonder and speculate about the sheep looking out from the landscape. And the sheep became a metaphor because they were very relatable and they provided a set of context. So we use language around animals. So you hear often people talking about sheeple now, or you hear people saying, oh, you're following the flock, or we make reference to being as gentle as the lamb. So I became interested in the language around it. But the sheep became a metaphor also because they're universally recognizable. They're associated with the land change and unwittingly with biodiversity loss, but they're associated also with security, home, pastoral care, warmth, sustenance, and tranquility. So I looked again at the sheep amid the flames, subjects in the world like me. And I was looking at the sheep in the burning landscape, which seemed prophetic and illustrative. I thought we're in this together, people setting fires, landscapes burning, and the sheep looking on. We're interconnected, mutually culpable, with a sense of solidarity and ignorance. And I wondered about the sheep. Did they have an awareness? Did they know what was going on? I wondered, what were they saying? And I wondered and thought, were some panicking on the hill, thinking, this is it, it's all over, I haven't fulfilled my destiny? Or were there artists among them who colluded with the farmer in selecting the colours for each season that marked them out? Or a philosopher who thought about the precarity of life and the folly of man? And I thought that to wonder and speculate like children do could offer us other ways and new visions for creating multi-species utopian futures. And so this is the I suppose the history or the prompt for the speculative fable Éiceanna an Tréad. So I'm working on another follow-up piece at the moment, and I'm very excited about the possibility of working with Éiceanna and some children around this connection to place and how we use words. So I hope you enjoyed it, and again, thank you very much.
Tanya, and I noticed in the chat Paul saying that it brought tears to his eyes. And while we associate the sheep as being, we think of following as a kind of passive sheep, what struck me about that wonderful poem was how it brought a sense of presence, the presence of the sheep. And if we could bring the same presence to what's happening around us, and were tuned in the way the sheep were present to the reality, then maybe we wouldn't have some of the problems which contemporary civilization has. So Gurv Mila Mahagat for tuning us into that it shows the power of the imagination and the role of the artist, which I think was never more important than at this moment in time. I know time is against us, so maybe, Peadar, would it be an idea to move on to Declan's contribution, and then we could round off with a conversation about what all of these resources can bring to our conversation. But I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, gur míle maith Martin agus Tanya aráis fad agus an clíon ar puirtú síos an sláináin an gaint well haring sé mise rinnos is jigan is slí níos daine. I was deeply drawn into it by both the images, by the beautiful, very sort of measured text, and I think your term trade and that one photograph of a sheep looking into my eyes really touched me deeply. Is sinna quid den tréad ar nói, níl with scaramach ui. And I'm taken by a lovely thing that Hilary Bradbury has just written in the chat, where she talks about my Irish Chinese daughter was born in the Chinese year of the sheep. There's a whole folk understanding of how sheep year people are creative artists. And for me, thank you for that, Hilary, what it does is make us realize that by going back into our own tradition, we're not cutting ourselves off from the world. We're in fact much more deeply touching other cultures. And that's the paradox, really. Sometimes people have given out to us, oh, isn't it wonderful we speak English? It's an international language. Why do you go back to Irish? But of course, by going back to Irish, we're actually going back to far deeper roots of our common humanity around the world. Hilary, thank you for that. So, Araigling gedi Declan, agus Declan, dúsáidú an fagil log anamnacha, agus rishe ku an Beiger gohfuil dini an sin nach digan Cadasbrílesh vocal. So the word log anam that Declan was talking about is simply our place names. But of course, he is drawing our attention to the richness of place names and to the particularity that we in Ireland live in a landscape where the names are like strangers. It makes the landscape a stranger to us. Why? Because we had this colonial endeavor of transliterating, not even translating names into English, but actually hearing a sound and trying to give that sound in a gobbledygook way in English. I was telling a friend of mine recently that the nearest town to us here, Nina, is called Anteanach, and telling him it means the market. And how much it opens your eyes then to a totally different way of looking at Nina. That's true for all our landscape, all our towns. So Declan, over to you to open our eyes to the wonders of what our log anamnacha, our place names, can open up for us.
Gur míle maith fad Peadar agus Camerá go mbeidh sé fíorheachar Finola agus Tanya a leanúint bhunas an túfás Tanya as an méid a bhí le rácha. So just Fuimar Dúras Hannah is quick than over are in a common fervor as Phobal Kilnina Bui or Logan Hain and Show Gilnina Bui. Agus Rilmer Taspontas Biog River Nullig Fui rank Wada na Han to Shen Ta Nyat Legenda going Fos. Ak Faulamientu on two Fos on the Logan. They really can teach you a lesson. And this first one that I'd like to talk to you about, I think is one that's got a real environmental lesson for us. So, Cian tú an sin, contusig sa slána an Cian tú luchafala, ach sa cúra Cian tú slíomh na glasha, or Glasgainach Hill. Slíomh na glasha is a really, really important part of the Burren, because it's there that the beautiful legend of the Glasgainach emanates from. And of course, the Glasgainach, vi bua múrache, bo a vienti, agus déta chi ein orhakerbe a liana. And all that was good. She was in the possession of Lun, the famous Gawa blacksmith, and vi three lava Lun, rod Kurgamur Lena Ho Margawa on Triula Shenavega. Ach Lawine, Honig agus Jertor Gorbana Honig, Neil May Curran Milaner Namana in the Echer. Honig on Ban Anklishta Shah La Orha, Creher, she brought the Sid and challenged the poor Glasgainach to fill the Sid. And of course, in attempting to do that, the Glasgainach gave as much milk as she could, starting shocked Shruha on Teaska, the 7 streams of Teaska. Ach, egadera boira, hep an Europe, via yen of egon mobok, agus hitchi liga, agus furshi boss, sanoit darvanum laba nadlasha, who's ervarachnik shin. Agus Tim Robinson Kupla Oichna Ella Moher Nadlasa Agus Tubber Nadlasha Ishtiach in a lair sky and shin. But of course, Nura Vasig on Voshen, it really was one of the original green legends. And a legend that resonates across many other cultures, because there's similar myths in many other cultures. And it was really about, I think, the milking of resources to the point of absolute collapse, so that the environment could yield no more to us. And no a hentu godian tefshin tira. Tá siúlód an áling fad faoin Hailta sin áit ar bhenim luchafola agus an siúlód lúbathe tá sin smuoinnig an Glasgainach agus an tlí a dimig na heachfaní as an tíorgréach ar fad ag an nám dríochtúil sin. So ar bhealach cosúla rusk Abergeen agus cosúla sin dáin áling tréad a scríbhtheanna. You know, téan an teanga, téan sé go smior onin ar bhealach ag míú dún an ceacht sin. Mas féidir bug ar aige bhí an Daras Lána onto the number 2 there. In the second slide, we see on Cutshin Hui. And the Cutshin was a common land, and somebody referred earlier on to the Brehon laws. There was much commonage in Brehon times. And in the commonage, we have 3 townlands coming together here: Leana or Yesh, Port Nabinia or Clay, agus Sechulra and Shin Tan Cutshin Hui. And the collective work, the farming people out together, they are working together on the commonage area. It just tells a lot. Like it's through a moor, nor a honig na tirni taluini rain. They fenced off a lot of the commonages, right, not just in the Burren, but right throughout Ireland. and just graspingly took them in order to avail themselves of more rent whenever possible. To kuchin hui freshen ta machin Samhlaíochta. We have cairns, Lapaca Germada, we have Stone Age quarries, we have ancient field systems. So as you walk through that landscape, it's touching on you, it's speaking to you, and it's telling you you're only one in a long chain that's been here before, that's been around for a long, long time. And are you the chain that's going to lose the beauty of this place? Samhlaíochta, mas féidir bogger aeigechin, féidir untubber. And of course, right in the center of that picture, it's difficult for you to see, but there's a little hole in the stone. If you can zone into it there and look at it carefully, the water is down underneath that Chloch Shiurdáin. And the tubber, of course, was a very, very sacred place right back throughout Celtic history. And there was a huge appreciation of the importance of water and the importance of clean water. Nor a honig na Christithe Iream, they put another veneer over the what they refer to as the pagan past of the Celts, and used the name Inina Bui as a saint and the associated a saint, as they did with so many wells right around the country. But those wells have a very, very ancient past. And what resonates with us from this is the powerful importance of water on Uisce. They thought Uisce agus batha agus níl bé cain fu Fuascailt, but Uisce agus batha a chur le chéile mar leis an air agus an Uisce sin bun agus bár on beocht na daoine. So ag boga aeráide go dtí an cathrú ceann inis, más féidir, féidir áitar bheanam seanamhóirí. Agus is seo chuid de bóthar a bhí ag Danis O'Brien, well fuair sé an tidal sor ní bacham lei sin, Danis O'Brien agus bhí bóthar beag ó Lemonach an Cúisleáin sin hawl an sin go dtí Turlach Mór átar a bhíoh Rossi fadó. Tá sé bristen is sé BC smitherini agus smutty de an seagus an siúd. But the road there, it brings something very, very clear to mind. This piece is in Rainemona. And that is, because of the narrowness of the road, you could never, ever avoid a conversation with your neighbor, either coming against you or walking along the same way. You brushed shoulders. Agus bhí an teagmháil ann idir daoine, agus binrod a bhí Harabheith táchtach. Agus Peadar, agus déach duine dul ar bhun an cap freisin. And I suppose when we look at that, we think of the greenways that we're creating now. And to me, it's one of the rianta dóchas, signs of hope for the future, that we're going to make that sort of a roadway, or recreate it back into our landscape to further connect the landscape with us. And tá bhíoláin filíochtáin hana tá mé just písín beag a léamh ó Seán Ó Siochrú, tá sé ag Spreagtar círí, múratrúie, ba chorgameach sé Spreagtar ceantar na bóirne, ach sure bín lucht ar gach aon duine. Ach dearn sé sinné de goras, dún cuin faoi tholas an tránhóna, búil is os clófar, dínt an hain is the cló ceart. So, mas féidir boga aeráide go ríist, mátá is don go beag an inam fágalgam, go dtí an céad ceann eile Éileán. Agus an ceann seo is ceann bídeach an ceann seo. Agus a ríist tá sé lonithe I Rainemona, agus na clocháin a thugtar air. And look at what the people did in order to carry out their farming. They created the beautiful footway of stones to take you across the little stream there, so that they could access the area known as Balawalya, which was rich pasture land, where they had their cows, They crossed it to tend to the cows, to tend to the animals, and to bring home the milk. So nor viidir ag captaháile go dtí sráidháilí beag Rhinamona, thugad gá bochéad banya trasna na haun ag an buinte sin. And it just shows I suppose to me the lesson there is the closeness of the farming practice to sustaining the actual environment at the time. Agus tá brónar mailing an Spreagtar tar éis chun dog right. Téma an isce atá ríist leis a ceann seo, Gaeilgeachtar. Atá gar agóhan de Páirc Náisiúnta Borna, tá Páirc Náisiúnta le Feicáil sa Cúra an sin. Agus a ríist tá an isce is túrlach a Gaeilgeachtar. So nuair a íslíonn levéil an isce, imíonn siar fad, agus bíonn páirc ann, is rud dríochtúlaigh speisialta agus nuair a hiúlann tú sa saora, bíonn sibras ann sa féir a bhíonn ag fós. Now, ní hardíonn sé gacúr mar bíonn sé flup uaireanta réatáirí agus fileann an isce ríis, ach sin an gnára a hardíonn. Agus a ríis sibras an timplacht atá oring, atá le fálam is stoilm as a ceann sin. Tá ceann na bhile is stoilm Eileen fágéan. Have you the next one there? Well, look, ná bí pic búra faoi sin, beidir gúil mid trídíthe chun deire, ach just téan, labhrann an teangaling agus sa ceann sin, labhrann an teanga sin in a most poignant way. Many cars pass along this road, some going to the national park, some unfortunately now using it as a throughway to the cliffs of Moher. Very few know, even the Cusheha, agus Muintir Roher, very few know that writing over the wall that the tragedy of the famine is brought to your mind. Mar sin got na mara. Agus a lán den nadíine bhí na cónaí sa chuidsin has, a fuair bás le ling Éiceaphobal tá siad curthaithe faoin gré an sin. So that soil tells a story of another, I suppose, not just environmental tragedy, but also a political tragedy when so little was done. Chun cabhrú le nadíine bachta a bhí a fuair bás. I've lost the count at this stage, Eileen. Maybe we're up as far as number 8. Tá sí go léir déanta. I just think, as I said to you, I mean, I can't scientifically state that, Loganamnacha will be a major help in halting environmental disaster. But I do believe, credum go hilles go humlain, má bhíonn an measagat de ceantar hain, de himplacht hain, de theanga hain, agus múnan na helmnacha dan na háitna, múnan siad an túfás dit, agus an leis an má bhíonn an meas sin agat, beidh tú anna chúramach le de himplacht. Míle buíochas ar fad as éisteacht.
For míle maith Declan bhí sé sin an sever ar fad agus an rud a dhéanann sé tócha ná sin a phréamhú sanáid. It brings us into our locality. It's just one example of the richness that all our localities have to offer up to us if we can explore them through the layers of place names. And by layers, I mean going back over the centuries, way back into our prehistoric past. We have a little under half an hour left, so we thought for drawing this to a close that it would be good to sort of broaden the focus a little bit and to touch in again on some of the resources that are there in our language that can open all this understanding up to us, this new. It's not just an understanding of the mind, it's also a feeling, it's a connectivity, it's a relationship, it's the people that Declan said we can't avoid when we walk on the road. And I'd like to invite Finola back in because she mentioned the Béalidis that she had picked up as a young person in Kerry. And of course, Béalidis, that the word is rendered in English as folklore, but I always feel it's the most awful translation, because Béalidis is, of course, the knowledge that has been passed down from generation to generation. It's not folk lore. It's the roots of the knowledge that is in our culture. Of course, our culture was much more an oral culture because of the destruction of the whole superstructure of Gaelic civilization from the 17th century on. So it wasn't up until the 20th century, it wasn't a written culture. And so therefore, if we don't go back into that Béalidis, we are losing so much of the richness of how the people who've lived in this landscape for thousands of years looked on it, thought about it, in a deep way told stories about it. So our Béalidis, and then the ways in which we celebrated it through the festivals, particularly the 4 great festivals of the Celtic year, and we just have celebrated Imbolc at the beginning of spring. So the festivals were to begin the different seasons. These are all resources that we have to go back to. So perhaps we could invite in Finola and then Tanya and Declan to talk about what these resources mean to them and what are the resources that they go to deepen their engagement.
Oh, yeah. Well, I suppose the main one that I've mentioned is through song and poetry, and seimineár agus uile. Yeah, and thinking ahead, even skipping to maybe even what might be practical. I've been certainly the féidir, the Celtic festivals. They certainly feed me, but I know there's a lot of people moving towards them again. So marking the beginning of spring with Imbolc, and it gives us the context then to bring in, for instance, a song that would be appropriate or a poem relative to that. So it's kind of thinking, you know, if you had community groups that instead of just doing them when tasks need doing, which is what we do, but if you might have the leisure to actually align them with one of the festivals, and that would give you a context then in which to bring in an element of ritual, because to me that's something that's very important, but it's very hard to find how to bring it in an organic way. And also, yeah, but I think and it's already happening, by focusing on the féidir, you know, that's one way. Another way I was thinking would be to maybe use some of the trasna aeráide, you know, and the notion of, you know, the patterns around the holy wells, the pilgrimages, that we might think of using those, involving actions in that way. And I see Peter Dordan is here, and I think he was involved in doing that years ago with in connection with the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears. But anyway, she needs to point a small, a really street and goal, and towards the end, we'll get a chance maybe to see what you think of the Buechas le Cring, which is a piece that I suppose trying to bring together this relationship, the relational aspect with trees, with nature, which is quite separate to the sort of planting trees and the activist work I do. But I suppose, I don't know if we did it in Ireland, but certainly the Indigenous people, again, in America would have this wonderful, they have this wonderful Thanksgiving address where they, when they come together, they give thanks to each and every one of the species and the trees and the people and the creator at the very end. It's that notion of relating directly, the sense that by appreciating trees, that helps them to flourish, and in flourishing, they're keeping us alive. So that's kind of the idea behind that song I have, but finding the context. I'm thinking if people were out walking in forests, that you might learn this song in a natural way, and that we'd sing it that way. So it's composed very simply for that occasion. I'm just trying to see how to bring those cultural rituals into the work we're doing, and it's very much work in progress. So she made a determination stuff.
Market Finola, Mil her Nashar Noi, Goody, almost na ground, Rivandera. Tanya, would you like to come in at this stage from your experience, which is very distinctive and very different, as to the resources that we can draw on? And now we're talking about what we offer to community groups up and down the country to allow them to connect in this deeper way with their sense of place.
Yeah, and I thanks so much to Finola and to Declan. It's a really interesting discussion, and I was writing down words that were coming up that, you know, resonated. I suppose just to go back to the project and getting the family involved, to I suppose frame it, that the family worked as what we called an intentional community of practice. So they were formed, despite them being my family, for the intention of looking through what we might be able to do for the future with this generational links. And over the course of the project, we engaged in a couple of workshops, creative workshops, making art. I would send out prompts sometimes with questions like, really playful questions like, what color do you think the wind is? Just really as a thought prompt. But what was the most interesting was that for one of the occasions we did, and it sounds kind of very clinical, but a participant-led workshop. And that was really positive and a great experience. And what we did was, my role as the artist in the socially engaged way was to pick a venue and a time. And then 3 people from the group gave a talk, or we were did a guided meditation around different things that they were interested around climate action. And only for COVID hit, we'd have done more of those. But it ended up, I'd booked a space, a public space above a bar, which was probably the wrong idea, but with great crack. We booked it for an hour, and we ended up staying for about 6 hours, and the conversations really developed, and it was really interesting about how other people shared their stories and listened and came up with solutions to each other's areas of interest. So I think following what Finola was saying about that idea of ritual and relationality and community walks, and what Declan talked about naming things, there could be lots of resources for communities to, maybe if some people in the community were interested in a particular theme, that they could do guided walks or guided sessions or making workshops around that. I think that could be really powerful.
Tanya, great ideas there, and I mean that's what we do want to focus in on in this project, is to give ways to people to engage, practical ways, and you gave many very good ideas there. Time is coming on. I'm going to invite Declan to come back in, and hopefully quite briefly to be able to share with us a bit more of how he works with different groups with the Lug Anamnacha, and then we'll move back to Finola, where she will take us through her almost na ground, her honouring of the trees, where we would all be able to sing along with her. So Declan, over to you.
Okay, Kinship Gramad, Peadar, and you hope me a couple no age. Nor women over Logan and Shogilin Bui. We're really relying on the wisdom of the people who live in the community. Whilst Tim Robinson did a lot of work for us, the amount of knowledge that's still in existence has actually overwhelmed us. We didn't realize that there was so much there, so much kept in the folk memory. And we want to ensure that that's going to be preserved. But I was big the home second one. Just rather one where you're in the lug and the rin to taggart the name of Chin Peadar was to a tussle. But while I'm down there, lug and umlana falling in her wound, ungurt. It's gurt in Shiguira. Cahar, he's a Dibberdarn. It's actually Cahar Duniski. Cashel, Shin Cashel Namoon. Why are we cloaking the richness and getting rid of it? Leave it all there for us. And I love, in terms of actions, the idea that Finola had, bringing, a group, coming together and visiting. I mean, anybody who was to go up to Coleman MacDua's well up under Slieve Cairn, and just to see the Uiv, the cave where he lived, the Champlain, the tiny church that's there, and the Tubber Ishka, Tavlesh, and just stop, smuin ar an rud atá timpla, agus raig sé big chunker moor ag an áit sin ar éan duine, agus tá méid sin áitina mar sin timpeall na hÉireann.
Declan, gur míle maith and a whole other layer you've brought in there in just a few words, that the wisdom is there in the community. And that's a whole other guide, I think, for us to have the courage to talk to people and to uncover that wisdom and to get people to value it, because of course people may have stories and they don't think they're worth very much. But in this great crisis that we face in humanity, that humanity faces now, all these stories, of course, matter because they open up our sensibility, not just our knowledge, to how we have to act and develop a new sensibility. So I'm going to hand back to Martin to introduce Finola, and that's going to be the closing part of our webinar.
Gurv Mahagat, a father, and thinking of on Major Villaró ag Declan, in my grandfather's little patch of land in the west of Ireland, every field had a name. Gartalishin, on Currach, Garv Drani. So it's not just places, but actual fields. And we have lost so much of that. So I think the work you're doing in Killiney Bui has huge relevance to communities around the country. But time is against us. So we're going to finish with a wonderful almost Nagran or Condacron from Finola, who's going to introduce it and is going to teach us all how to sing it, but we will remain muted. So we will have bathroom singing at home as we follow in the footsteps of Finola. Éiceaphobal a Finola.
Remarkable. And just before that, do you mind, it was just two ideas that came to me that I think could be very simply done. And one is, for instance, in Burren College, with wonderful talks here where you go out and you learn about the wildflowers and everything else. If one person could go along who was familiar with Irish and had a list of or Zoe Devlin's book or whatever, so that when the expert describes them in English and so on, that the other person could just say, and you know what, it's called such and such in Irish. You know, it would be a very simple way of bringing in all of that knowledge to what's, building a layer on what's already there. And the other thing briefly I wanted to mention, just because it's it comes from that whole the richness of the indigenous wisdom, and how now there's a whole movement on the rights of nature, and interestingly how that has taken off in Ireland too. So again, you have that resonance here, and I see again, I know Peter Doran is a spokesperson for that, or very involved in it. So Cartha a Nádur, Sin Rudatá, attack the Raigenish. Yeah, there's something will say in the mix it's just showing this kind of zeitgeist back to indigenous wisdom here in Ireland. I hope she shot Roada, so Shanska make Almo in Cainteoirí and this ago, Martha Jolam, Washington Dainella, but Fishkelly, I'm out wrong. Yeah, so Dermish Shinlina, agus an son Derishif Shinlina. Those of you who are feeling very adventurous, this is intended to be taught orally or hourly. So if you want, you could look away without the words and just do it by sound, because that's how it would be taught. But you don't have to. The words will come up here if you're somebody who likes to have all of that. So we'll actually begin with the English. So, oak, pine, and holly. Oak, pine, and holly, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Dargius is quellen, our moiches lay, or muchas live. Nobles of the forest, nobles of the forest, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Uisle na Gaeilge, uisle na Gaeilge, or muchas live, or muchas live. Food and fire and shelter, for food and fire and shelter, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Aspairtin is Stephen, or muchas live, or muchas live. Éiceapobal and hazel, Éiceapobal and hazel, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Cultúr is Finola Ó Siochrú, or muchas live, or muchas live. Nobles of the forest, nobles of the forest, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Uisle na Gaeilge, uisle na Gaeilge, or muchas live, or muchas live. For food and fire and shelter, for food and fire and shelter, our thanks to you, our thanks to you. Aspairtin is Stephen, aspairtin is Stephen, or muchas live, or muchas live. Sinead. So they were just the songs of the Uisle na Gaeilge. One could extend it to the other three, and I might, but I'm not sure if the contemporary attention span is long enough to be able to accommodate that. And maybe just to say, again, going to that right-hand side of me, when I was thinking of this, I was walking down the Bowery and we used to shoot more people, and so, and the trees were there to my right, and I was asking for inspiration, and I got that tune, da, 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 da. The wind in the trees was giving me that kind of tune. So anyway, it's an attempt to bring us out of the head and into relationship and into gratitude for what they do for us, what they give to us, you know.
Garav Mila Mahagat, and gratitude, I think, if we could embody that sense of gratitude for everything when we leave this webinar and go out and look around at the gifts which are everywhere and begin to say gratitude, say thank you to the trees and to the air and to the ground and to everything. And even as we prepare our meal, to have that sense of indigenous gratitude to nature that has provisioned us with everything and without which we do not sustain life on this planet. So Garav Mila Mahagat for that wonderful ode to the trees, almost Nagran. And I think it's a sense and a sensibility we might all do to bring away with us. So I think it just rests for me and for, I'm sure Peadar will say as well, and I'm echoing what's in the chat, our muichas, our meal of muichas, le Finola, le Tanya, le Declan Kelleher, an cultúr agus na choiríochtaí iontacha a thug Shiurdáin. Our heartfelt thanks to Finola, to Tanya, and to Declan for those wonderful, inspiring contributions they gave us today. And as Eileen said, there will be recordings online in due course. It's a very rich resource. It will contribute to a resource kit which will be made available as a result of this whole series. And we do sense from the participation today that you feel, as we feel, that the Irish language and tradition has a huge amount to contribute to this. So, an muichas slí gach aine a bhí ilochar inniu. Our thanks to you all for participating. Peadar.
Míle maithagad Gaeilge, gur míle maithagad le Finola, le Tanya, le Declan, as bhór bhlathúlacht agus sibse ag cuirnar láthair as na rudí a bhíonn sibse ag gabháileo á dhéanamh. I think you have enriched all of us enormously, each of you, from your different practices, showing us how much, by getting back in touch with that which is most native, most under our feet, in our noses, in our hair, in our ears, that we have something to bring to our society and to the world to help us to move beyond this moment of enormous crisis for humanity into a far richer re-engagement with the beautiful world and the many, many species that we share this planet with. Mar sin gur míle maithagad Gaeilge agus dus na daoine Gaeilge a bhí láthair inniuh. Sláinte.